Every system that has ever tried to control a human being needed one thing first, something you couldn't live without. Not power, not intelligence, not even fear. Leverage, a hook buried somewhere inside your obligations that someone else could pull whenever they needed you to comply. Remove the hook, and the entire machine loses its grip on you, instantly. Not because you fought it, but because there was nothing left in you for it to hold on to. This isn't a story about rebellion. Rebellion still needs an enemy to react to. This is about something far quieter, and far more dangerous to anyone who's ever tried to control you, needing nothing at all. Control has never required force. Force is expensive, visible, and eventually provokes resistance. What every institution, employer, and market actually relies on is something cheaper and far more efficient: dependency. Psychologists studying human motivation identified a spectrum most people never think to examine. At one end sits pure external regulation, where behavior exists only because of a paycheck, a threat, or a fear of consequence. Slightly further along sits something sneakier: interjected regulation, where a person polices their own behavior not out of genuine conviction, but to avoid guilt, humiliation, or the loss of status in other people's eyes. Almost everyone operating under either of these states believes their choices are their own. They aren't. They're renting their behavior to whichever external force is holding the lease. On the far end of that same spectrum sits something almost nobody reaches, because almost nobody is taught it exists: integrated regulation, where action flows entirely from a person's own core values, with zero dependency on outside approval or outside reward. When a person operates from this state, the carrots stop working, so do the sticks. There's simply nothing left to dangle. Here's where most people who think they're free actually reveal how controlled they still are. The moment authority pushes on them, they push back, loudly, emotionally, sometimes destructively. This feels like defiance. It isn't. Researchers call it reactance, and it comes with a hidden catch: a person raging against a restriction is still entirely defined by the thing they're raging against. Their next move is dictated by what the controller just did. That's not freedom. That's a leash with extra tension on it. There's a second, far quieter response most people never develop, because it requires something reactive. Rebellion never does total detachment from the outcome. A person operating from this state hears the demand, acknowledges it exists, and then makes their decision based purely on their own internal compass, completely unmoved by whether compliance or defiance is the expected response. This is the actual difference between someone who looks unshakable and someone who's simply loud about their resistance. One is still tethered. The other walked out of the arena entirely. There is a distinction almost nobody draws correctly, and it explains why so many people who chase power end up more controlled, not less. One version of power is influence, the capacity to bend other people's behavior to your will. The other is autonomy, the capacity to direct your own existence without needing anyone's permission or approval to do it. Most hierarchical environments train people to chase the first kind as a defense mechanism. Operating on a simple, exhausting logic: dominate others before they dominate you. But research on human motivation reveals something almost nobody expects. When a person actually secures real autonomy over their own life, their appetite for controlling others quietly disappears. The hunger for influence was never really about power. It was compensation for a lack of it, redirected outward. The person who needs nothing has no use for influence over anyone. They've already secured the only kind of power that was ever real. None of this stays theoretical for long, because modern economies have built an entire infrastructure specifically engineered to manufacture dependency at scale. Consider what the numbers actually say about the average person walking through any American city right now. Total national credit card debt sits above $1 trillion, with the average balance per consumer sitting near $7,000. A fixed monthly obligation that has to be serviced regardless of how someone feels about their job, their boss, or the direction their life is heading. Auto loans stack nearly $2 trillion on top of that, anchoring transportation itself to a recurring monthly payment most people never fully escape before trading up for another one. And underneath all of it sits the real vulnerability: liquidity. Roughly half the adult population in the country cannot cover 3 months of basic expenses if their income disappeared tomorrow. A meaningful share hold no emergency savings whatsoever. The median cash cushion across the entire country sits at a number most people spend in a single bad month. This isn't an accident of bad luck spread evenly across the population. It's the exact condition that keeps a workforce compliant. A person with no runway cannot walk away from a toxic job, cannot decline an unreasonable demand, cannot negotiate from strength. Because the moment they lose that paycheck, the debt obligations don't pause to wait for them. Nobody hands you a contract that says, "You will remain compliant as long as you owe us money." Nobody needs to. The obligation itself does the enforcing. Financial researchers tracking displaced workers found something quietly devastating: a significant share of people who lose employment don't recover into equivalent roles. Some drop out of the workforce entirely. Others, facing an immediate cash shortfall, liquidate retirement accounts outright, rather than executing a proper rollover, trading decades of future compounding for a few months of present, tense survival. This is what leverage actually looks like in a modern economy. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like just how life works. A treadmill so normalized that most people never question why they can't afford to say no to things that clearly aren't serving them. But the moment a person builds even a few months of liquid runway, something structural shifts. Data on workers who establish accessible cash reserves shows a measurable change, not just in stress levels, but in behavior itself. They negotiate differently. They walk away from bad terms they once would have swallowed. Cash reserves don't just sit there. They actively convert desperation into leverage the other direction. None of this is a new discovery. Nearly 2 centuries ago, an American philosopher diagnosed the exact same mechanism, decades before credit cards or auto loans existed to enforce it. He described organized society as something closer to a shareholding arrangement, where members quietly agree to trade away their independence in exchange for the comfort of belonging. His argument was blunt: real personal power only exists once a person sheds the dependencies keeping them tethered to that arrangement in the first place. A student of his took the theory and tested it directly, not in an essay, but in practice. He built a small cabin, stripped his living requirements down to the bare biological minimum, and discovered something that should unsettle anyone still chasing more. Once actual expenses collapse to near nothing, the amount of labor required to sustain a life collapses right alongside it. What remained wasn't deprivation, it was time. Enormous uncontested stretches of time, freed from the obligation to keep earning simply to keep servicing debts he no longer had. He wasn't practicing austerity for its own sake. He was dismantling leverage, deliberately, systematically, the same way you disarm a trap before walking past it. Strip this down to its rawest form, and the entire mechanism becomes a simple equation. Control requires a lever requires a need. Eliminate the need, and the lever has nothing left to grip. An institution can threaten someone's paycheck only if that person's survival depends on that specific paycheck. It can threaten someone's reputation only if that person has anchored their identity to external approval. It can threaten someone's comfort only if that person has quietly agreed that comfort requires an ever-expanding list of material acquisitions to maintain. The person who needs nothing doesn't win this equation through confrontation. They win it by making the entire premise irrelevant. There's no lever to pull, no debt to call in, no status to strip away, because none of it was ever load-bearing to begin with. This is precisely why aggressive control systems generate their own resistance over time. The harder any structure squeezes a population that still has room to react, the more friction, defiance, and quiet sabotage it produces. But squeeze a population that has already made itself unleverageable, and the pressure simply passes through them. There's nothing there for it to catch on. Picture the two versions of the same person, side by side. One carries revolving debt, minimal savings, and an identity quietly stitched together from job titles, purchases, and other people's approval. Every major decision in that life gets filtered through a single unspoken question: what happens to me if this goes away? The other carries no revolving debt. Months of runway sit untouched in reserve. Identity isn't rented from a title, a brand, or an audience. It's owned outright, sourced entirely from internal values that don't fluctuate based on outside opinion. Every major decision in that life gets filtered through a completely different question: does this actually align with what I've already decided matters? Same economy, same institutions, same pressure being applied from every direction, completely different outcomes. Because one of them built a hook for the world to grab, and the other quietly removed it years ago. Nobody is coming to hand you this state. No employer benefits from you needing less. No market benefits from you wanting less. No institution benefits from a population that can simply walk away. Which means the removal of every hook currently attached to you has to be deliberate. The debt gets paid down on purpose. The reserve gets built on purpose. The identity gets pulled back from other people's opinions on purpose. None of it happens by accident. And none of it happens by asking permission from the systems that benefit from you staying tethered. You don't need to fight the people trying to control you. Fighting still keeps you tied to them. You only need to become the kind of person they have nothing left to hold. That's not rebellion. That's sovereignty.